Greetings, fleshbags. I am the great Jin-Gitaxias, core Augur and the most intelligent of the Phyrexian Praetors. I'm broadcasting across the multiverse to boast of my imminent invasion of all realms. Through rigorous research, I have lured in and captured an arrogant child by the name of Jace Bellerin. And after breaking his weak mind, I not only enslaved him, but studied his ability to walk the realm between realms, what he calls the blind eternities, and developed a way to transport my Phyrexian army between planes. This will be a description of all that you have to look forward to when we come to spread Phyrexia's blessings to a plane near you. First of all, me, Jin-Gitaxias, core Augur. I have power and toughness 5-4, and I cost 8 blue. I possess the ability Flash, and at the beginning of my end step, I draw 7 cards, and each of my opponent's hand size is reduced by 7. This means I shall be ever ready, and my victims will be incapable of defending themselves. Next, I shall detail my new second-in-command, Jace, wielder of mysteries. As stated previously, I have broken his mind and put him under my command. Jace has 4 loyalty on entry, and has, if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. For +1 loyalty, I may make a target player put the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, and then I draw a card. For -8 loyalty, I may draw 7 cards. Then if my library is empty, I win the game. My next order of business is discussing the soldiers in my army. Burnished Heart can be sacrificed to find me 2 basic lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Chasm Skulker gets a +1/+1 counter whenever I draw a card, and when it dies, I create 1/1 squid tokens equal to the number of counters it had. My blessed consecrated Sphinx has flying and draws me 2 cards whenever my opponents draw a card. Geode Golem has trample, and whenever it hits one of my opponents, I may be summoned from the command zone for free. Laboratory Maniac, bless his twisted mind, wins me the game if I attempt to draw a card from an empty library. Phyrexian Metamorph can enter as a copy of any artifact or creature on the field. Psychosis Crawler, one of my favorite creations, has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in my hand, and whenever I draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. Solemn Simulacrum searches for a basic land when it enters, and when it dies I draw a card. Spark Double is one of several spells I have thanks to Jace, and it enters as a copy of a creature or planeswalker I control, except that it enters with an extra +1/+1 or loyalty counter and is not legendary. Torrential Gearhulk has Flash, and when it enters I might cast an instant from my grave for free, then exile it. Trophy Mage is an example of a creature I am able to summon a clone of courtesy of Jace, since the original resides in another plane. When it enters, I may search for an artifact with mana cost 3 and put it into my hand. Knowledge is power, and so I possess many ways of acquiring and recalling knowledge, including Archaeomancer, which returns an instant or sorcery from my grave to my hand when it enters. Blue Sun's Zenith has X in its cost and allows me to target a player and have them draw X cards. Then this spell gets shuffled back into my library. The only time the target player would not be me is if I can force an opponent to draw from an empty library. Brainstorm lets me draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from my hand on top of my library. Fact or fiction has me reveal the top 5 cards of my library and choose an opponent to separate them into 2 piles. Then I may take one and put the other into the grave. Girapur Orrery allows every combatant to play an extra land on each of their turns and draw 3 cards at the start of their upkeeps if they have none in hand. Library of Leng removes my hand size, and if I am forced to discard a card, I may put it on top of my library instead of the grave. Mirrodin Besieged is a crude representation of one of my numerous victories in battle, as I led an assault against the wretched Mirrans. When it enters, I choose Mirran or Phyrexian. For the former, I create a 1/1 Mir token whenever I cast an artifact, and for the latter, at the start of my end step I draw a card, then discard a card, and if there are 15 or more artifacts in my grave, target opponent loses the game. Ponder has me look at the top 3 cards of my library, put them back in any order, shuffle my library if I so choose, then draw a card. Pull from Tomorrow is an X-cost spell that allows me to draw X cards, then discard 1. Serum Visions depicts a time I got high on Phyrexian ink moth juice, and it had made me draw a card and scry 2. It was a weird trip. Stroke of Genius is Jace's imperfect recollection of a story of how Urza came up with the idea for our greatest foe, Karn, the Silver Golem. It is an X-cost spell that has target player draw X cards. Treasure Cruise has Delve, and enables me to draw 3 cards. Windfall forces every opponent to discard their hand and draw cards equal to the greatest number of cards exiled this way. As usual, I play 4-dimensional chess while my opponents are playing checkers. And the first card of this segment is As Foretold, an enchantment that receives a time counter at the start of my upkeep. Once each turn, I may pay 0 rather than the mana cost for a spell, with mana cost less than or equal to the number of time counters it has. Caged Sun has me choose a color when it enters, boosting creatures I command of the chosen color by +1/+1. Whenever a land's ability adds mana of the chosen color, I add 1 extra mana of that color. Clear the Mind is a fail-safe if I go through my library too quickly, allowing me to shuffle target player's grave into their library and then draw a card. Enter the Infinite has me draw my library and then put any card on my hand onto my library, removing my hand size until the next turn. Gilded Lotus taps to add 3 mana of any color. High Tide has every island on the field add 1 extra blue mana when it's tapped for mana. Mindslaver can tap and be sacrificed to allow me to control a combatant during their next turn. Nevinyrral's Disc enters tapped and can be tapped to destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. Omniscience is a wonderful complement to Enter the Infinite. It allows me to cast spells from my hand for free, and after drawing my library, this means I can cast every spell in my repertoire for free. Sky Diamond is a simple gem that can tap for 1 blue. Soul Ring taps for 2 colorless mana. Spellbook removes my hand limit, and Thought Vessel does the same thing and can tap for 1 colorless mana. Thrawn Dynamo taps for 3 colorless mana, and Unwinding Clock untaps all artifacts I control during each other combatant's untap step. Voltaic Key can be tapped to untap target artifact, and Wayfarer's Bauble may be sacrificed to search for a basic land. Many of these spells are intended to make it much easier for me to be summoned to the battlefield, and the sooner I arrive on the scene, the sooner I can end my opponent's pathetic lives. Jace calls himself the Mind Sculptor. I should know. I've dug through his mind, and it's for that reason, and the fact that I've enslaved the Mind Mage, that I am clearly the superior mind manipulator. To that end, here are some of the ways that I can and will alter your minds. Aether Spouts puts every attacking creature on the bottom of their owner's library. Gitaxian Probe is a device I use during surgery, and its blades are sharp as obsidian. It allows me to look at a target combatant's hand, then I draw a card. Jace's Erasure is an admittedly impressively devious spell my newer lieutenant came up with, and it has target combatant put a card from the top of their library into their graveyard every time I draw a card, so they shall be losing cards quite frequently with this enchantment. Sphinx's Tutelage has target opponent put the top 2 cards of their library into their grave whenever I draw a card, and if they're both non-land cards that share a color, this process is repeated. I can pay into it to draw a card and discard a card. It was the Sphinx depicted in this enchantment that gave me an advantage while digging through Jace's mind. This spell was crafted by the Sphinx and proves that they are a superior telepath to Jace, something he would never admit. By exploiting his insecurity, I broke his mind's defenses. Psychic Surgery lets me look at the top 2 cards of an opponent's library whenever they shuffle their library, and I may exile one of them and put the other back on top. It's also what I intend to do to some of the poor souls I encounter in other worlds, for research purposes, of course. Psychic Corrosion sends the top 2 cards of each combatant's library to their grave whenever I draw a card, and it's what eventually happens to any mind strong enough to resist my influence. Their minds will corrode from the strain. All battlements fall in time, and none shall resist my power. As far as defensive measures are concerned, Arcane Denial is the first of many counter spells in my arsenal. It counters a spell, letting its controller draw 2 cards at the next turn's upkeep, and letting me draw a card at the same time. Counterspell is self-explanatory. If you want an explanation on what it does, you are a fool, and yours will be among the first minds to melt from the blazing heat of my intellect. Desertion counters a spell, and if it's an artifact or creature, I put it under my control instead of its owner's graveyard. Disallow counters a spell, activated ability or triggered ability. Dissipate exiles the spell it counters. Engulf the Shore returns all creatures with toughness less than or equal to the number of islands I control to their hands. The sea monster depicted in this memory would be an excellent asset to my army. Assuming I can transport such a massive creature between realms, I may consider prioritizing its assimilation. Evacuation simply returns all creatures to their owner's hands, and negate counters a non-creature spell. Propaganda is what this video is. The spell prevents creatures from attacking me unless its controller pays 2 for each creature attacking me. The actual propaganda in this video is intended to prepare you and the other residents of every plane in the multiverse for our invasion, not to defend themselves, but to know that they cannot succeed, and should give up as soon as they see me and my forces. Reality Shift exiles a creature and manifests the top card of its owner's library. Rewind counters a spell and untaps up to 4 of my lands, and Unwind does the same thing for non-creature spells, except it untaps only 3 lands. Speaking of lands, I intend to conquer all of them. Here's a look at some of the first realms I'm planning on paying a visit to. These previews are brought to you by Jace. You have him and his weakness to blame for the coming storm. Castle Vantris enters tapped, unless I control an island, and can either add a blue or scry 2. Desert of the Mindful enters tapped and can be cycled. Lonely Sandbar is the same card except its cycling cost is cheaper. Lotus Field as hexproof, enters tapped and sacrifices 2 of my lands when it enters, but it may tap for 3 mana. Myriad Landscape enters tapped and can be sacrificed to search my library for 2 basic lands that share a land type. Mystic Sanctuary enters tapped unless I control at least 3 islands, and if it enters untapped, I may return an instant or sorcery from my grave to the top of my library. It is also the second preview of the land Jace calls Eldraine, and yes, that does mean it is at the top of my shit list. Reliquary Tower removes my hand limit, and Temple of the False God taps for 2 mana as long as I have 5 or more lands. Now that we've covered all of the reasons for you to fear the Core Augur's armies, we now move on to the segment of the broadcast where I roast my fellow Praetors. Urabrask is the least worthy of that title, holding far too much empathy. For the incompleted Mirrans, his empathy shall be his downfall. Then there's Shieldred, a simply perplexing being. She possesses 2 faces, one on her head and one on her spider-like torso. Which one do I look at when I speak to her? It's simply unsettling. Vorinclex is my most hated Praetor, always slobbering about evolution and how much he dislikes sentience, even his own. If I have to listen to his idiotic ramblings much longer, I shall grant him his wish and remove his sentience. Finally, there is Elish Norn, easily the greatest threat to me out of the Praetors, and the only other one that I suspect knows about other realms, and she likely knows what I'm planning, or so she believes. She is nearly as intelligent as she thinks she is. Nearly. Also, people like to say I have a big head, but get a load of this one. Her head stretches from Urabrask's Forge all the way to the far end of Shieldred Swamp. Every time she turns her head, she decapitates several dozen Phyrexians and or Mirrans. I'm just going to keep sharpening the points of her head and adding thin weights to either end as she sleeps, in hopes that one day she'll topple over from the weight and get her head stuck in the ground. With that, it is time to wrap up this broadcast. Thank you all for listening. All that I ask is that you be ready to receive Phyrexia's blessings once I crack interplanar travel. That is an eventuality, by the way. It will happen. Until then, enjoy what time you have left, fleshbags.